"You have 5 seconds to leave," the single dad said it, calm as a whisper. But when the gang laughed, what they didn't know was that the quiet cook they were mocking had once led a secret Navy SEAL team, and the next 5 seconds changed everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening sun painted long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor of Jake's diner. Jake Tanner's weathered hands moved methodically as he wiped down the counter, the familiar motion as much a part of his daily routine as breathing. The radio on the shelf behind him crackled softly, Merle Haggard's voice singing about better days gone by. "Dad, what do you think about this math problem?" Ellie's pencil tapped against her workbook as she sat at the counter, her legs swinging beneath the worn red vinyl stool. Her dark hair fell forward, catching the golden light streaming through the dusty windows. Jake set down his rag and leaned over to look at her worksheet. "Let me see, sweetheart." The familiar scent of coffee and grilled onions hung in the air as Jake studied the equation. These quiet moments with Ellie were what he lived for now. 3 years had passed since Marianne's death, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. He could still hear her laugh echoing through the diner, see her straightening the salt shakers with careful precision. "You need to move the decimal point over here," Jake explained, pointing to the paper. "Then divide both sides." Ellie's face lit up with understanding. "Oh, that makes so much more sense." She erased her previous work and started again, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Jake resumed his cleaning, stealing glances at his daughter. At 12, she was already showing glimpses of the woman she would become. She had Marianne's kind eyes and determined spirit. The thought squeezed his heart. "Dad?" Ellie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I was thinking, maybe we could hang up some fairy lights?" She gestured to the blank walls. "You know, around the windows, it would make the diner look happier." Jake paused, studying the tired walls. The place had seen better days. The vinyl booths were cracked in places, the chrome trim had lost its shine, and the wallpaper was beginning to peel at the corners. But it was theirs. "Fairy lights, huh?" He gave her a small smile. "Might not be a bad idea." "Really?" Ellie beamed. "We could get the white ones like the ones Mom used to put up at Christmas." From the kitchen, Luis poked his head through the service window. The 17-year-old busboy had been quietly washing dishes, but Jake could tell he'd been listening. "Mr. Tanner?" Luis's voice was hesitant. "I could stay late and help put them up. If you want, I'm pretty good with that kind of stuff." Jake considered the offer. Luis was a good kid, quiet but dependable. He'd hired him 6 months ago, and despite the diner's struggle to make ends meet, he'd never regretted it. "Thanks, Luis. We'll see about those lights soon." Jake glanced at his watch and moved to flip the open sign to closed. Through the windows, the town of Hollow Creek stretched out before him, quiet and still in the fading light. The empty storefronts across the street told their own story of hard times. The shuttered hardware store, the vacant dress shop with its sun-bleached mannequins. The sight stirred a familiar ache in his chest. "Almost done with that homework, Ellie?" Jake asked, trying to shake off the melancholy. "Just one more problem." She squared her shoulders, determination written across her face. The silence settled around them like a comfortable blanket. Just the soft click of Ellie's pencil, the hum of the refrigerator, and that old country song floating through the air. Jake moved through his closing routine with practiced efficiency, counting the day's modest earnings and storing them in the register. These evening moments held a particular kind of loneliness, one he'd grown accustomed to but never quite made peace with. The empty chairs seemed to whisper of busier times, when the diner had been full of laughter and life. When Marianne had been here, greeting customers by name and making everyone feel like family. Luis emerged from the kitchen, his apron damp from dishwater. "Everything's cleaned up back there, Mr. Tanner. Need anything else before I go?" Before Jake could answer, bright headlights swept across the windows, filling the diner with harsh white light. The door burst open with a bang that made Ellie jump, her pencil clattering to the floor. 3 men stalked in, young but with hard eyes and harder expressions. The leader, wearing a leather jacket despite the warm evening, fixed his gaze on the register behind Jake. Jake's body tensed, but his voice remained steady and low. Years of training kicked in as he assessed the threat. The bulge of a weapon beneath the leader's jacket, the nervous energy of the shortest one, the calculating look in the third man's eyes. "We're closed," Jake said quietly, already moving to position himself between the men and Ellie. Cash register's still full though, ain't it? The leader's mouth twisted into an ugly smile. Hand it over, old man, and nobody gets hurt. Jake could hear Ellie's rapid breathing behind him, could sense Luis frozen in place by the kitchen door. The radio continued to play softly, an incongruous backdrop to the tension filling the room. Time seemed to slow as Jake drew himself up to his full height. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had once commanded men in combat. You have 5 seconds to leave. The words hung in the air like smoke. The gang members exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence wavering as something in Jake's steady gaze made them question their choices. The oldest gang member's sneer wavered as he met Jake's steady gaze. Something in those calm eyes made him take half a step backward, though he tried to hide it with a swagger. His leather jacket creaked as he shifted his weight, uncertain. You deaf, old man? The gang member spat, but his voice cracked slightly. We said empty the register. Jake didn't move. His stance was relaxed but purposeful, hands loose at his sides. Years of training had taught him to read threats in the smallest details. The nervous twitch of the youngest gang member's fingers, the way the third one kept glancing at the door. They were amateurs playing at being dangerous. Behind the counter, Luis's trembling hands steadied as he slowly reached for his phone. The youngest busboy had seen enough YouTube videos to know this moment needed to be recorded. With shaking fingers, he pressed record, keeping the phone low and partially hidden behind a napkin holder. I won't repeat myself, Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from experience rather than volume. 4 seconds now. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as silence filled the diner. Ellie pressed closer to her father's back, her small hands gripping his worn denim shirt. Though scared, she felt the solid strength of him, unmovable as a mountain. The youngest gang member licked his lips nervously. Marco, maybe we should— Shut up, Denny, the leader snapped. But his eyes never left Jake's face. Something about the older man's stillness was deeply unsettling. Most people showed fear. They stammered. They pleaded. They shook. This man looked at them like he was calculating angles and distances. 3. Jake counted calmly. The third gang member, Flint, tugged at Marco's sleeve. Come on, man. This ain't worth it. 2. Marco's hand twitched toward his waistband. But Jake's subtle shift in stance made him freeze. In that microscopic movement, the gang leader caught a glimpse of something familiar, the kind of efficient, deadly grace he'd seen in his older brother who'd served in Afghanistan. His blood ran cold. 1. This ain't over, Marco snarled, but he was already backing toward the door. You watch yourself, old man. The bell above the door jangled as the 3 men retreated into the darkness. Their hurried footsteps echoed on the cracked sidewalk, followed by the sound of squealing tires as their car peeled away. Jake didn't relax his stance until the red taillights had disappeared around the corner. Only then did he turn to check on Ellie, his hands gentle as they smoothed her hair. You okay, sweetheart? Ellie nodded, her face pale but composed. I wasn't scared, she lied bravely, making Jake's heart squeeze with pride and worry. She looked up at him with wondering eyes. You looked different, Dad. Like a soldier. Before Jake could respond, the familiar flash of red and blue lights painted the diner's windows. Sheriff Raymond Holt's heavy boots crossed the threshold moments later, his weathered face creased with concern. Got a call about suspicious activity, the sheriff said, his keen eyes taking in the scene. Everyone all right here, Jake? We're fine, Raymond, Jake answered, his voice back to its usual quiet tone. Just some kids causing trouble, nothing serious. Luis emerged from behind the counter, his phone clutched tight in his sweating palm. Mr. Tanner stopped them, Sheriff. They wanted money, but he was amazing. He just stood there and they ran. The sheriff's eyebrows rose as he pulled out his notepad. That right? Mind telling me exactly what happened? Jake downplayed the incident as he gave his statement, careful to keep his description vague and simple. No need to mention the years of combat training that had let him read the situation instantly. No need to explain how he'd recognized the telltale signs of concealed weapons, or how he'd positioned himself to control any potential conflict. Just told them to leave, he said with a shrug. They made the right choice. Sheriff Holt's pen scratched across his notepad, but his eyes studied Jake with thoughtful consideration. You sure that's all? Because Luis here looks like he saw something pretty impressive. Dad was like a superhero. Ellie piped up, her earlier fear forgotten in the excitement of telling the story. He wasn't scared at all. Jake squeezed her shoulder gently. Nothing heroic about it. Just one of them gone before anyone got hurt. The sheriff nodded slowly, closing his notebook. Well, I'll increase patrols in the area for the next few days. You sure you don't want to press charges? I could put out an APB based on your descriptions. No need, Jake said firmly. They won't be back. After a few more questions and concerned glances, Sheriff Holt left them to lock up for the night. Jake moved through the familiar closing routine, counting the register, checking the kitchen, turning off the lights one by one. Luis lingered by the door, his phone now hidden in his pocket where the upload confirmation still blinked. Mr. Tanner? Thank you for protecting us. Jake nodded, managing a small smile. Get home safe, Luis. Your mother will be worried. Finally, they stood outside in the cool night air as Jake turned the key in the lock. The street was quiet now, empty except for the moths dancing around the flickering streetlight. Ellie held his hand as they walked to their truck, her grip a little tighter than usual. In the darkness of the parking lot, Luis's phone screen glowed briefly as the video finished uploading. The red light blinked once more and went dark. But by then, the digital wheels were already turning, carrying the evening's events out into the world. Jake jolted awake to the sound of rapid knocking and Ellie's excited voice piercing through his bedroom door. Dad! Dad, wake up! You're on the internet! He blinked at his alarm clock, 6:45 a.m. Rubbing his eyes, Jake swung his legs over the side of the bed. What do you mean I'm on the internet? The door burst open, and Ellie bounded in, still in her purple pajamas, her tablet clutched to her chest. Her brown hair was a mess of tangles, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. Luis's video went viral overnight. Look! She thrust the tablet at him. Jake squinted at the screen, his heart sinking as he watched himself confronting the gang members. The footage was shaky but clear enough, showing both Luis's cell phone recording and the diner's security camera feed side by side. The video already had over 100,000 views. The comments are amazing, Ellie gushed, scrolling through them. Coolest dad ever. Such a boss. Oh, and this one. The calm dad hero strikes again. Jake ran a hand through his hair. Honey, this isn't... A car horn blared outside. Jake went to the window and pulled back the curtain. His stomach tightened at the sight of 2 news vans parked across the street. There are reporters everywhere, Ellie said, bouncing on her toes. Channel 5 is out front. And look, someone made a meme of you. Jake groaned. This was exactly what he didn't want. He'd spent years building a quiet life here in Hollow Creek, away from attention, away from his past. Now it felt like the walls were closing in. Get dressed for school, he said gently. I'll handle this. But handling it proved harder than expected. By the time they left for school, 4 more news vans had arrived. Reporters swarmed their driveway, thrusting microphones and shouting questions. Jake kept Ellie close, politely declining to comment as they made their way to his old pickup truck. Mr. Tanner, how does it feel to be a local hero? What made you stand up to those gang members? Are you worried about retaliation? The questions followed them all the way to Ellie's school. Jake waited until she was safely inside before heading to the diner. The parking lot was already full. More news vans, curious onlookers, and what looked like actual customers. Inside, Luis was overwhelmed at the counter, trying to handle the sudden rush. His face lit up with relief when he saw Jake. I'm so sorry, Mr. Tanner, Luis said, looking guilty. I didn't think the video would spread like this. Jake squeezed the young man's shoulder. Not your fault, son. Let's just focus on serving these folks. The morning passed in a blur of coffee pours and interview requests. Jake lost count of how many times he said, no comment, or just doing what anyone would do. By noon, his head was pounding. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake looked up to see Reverend Samuel Cole walking in. The pastor's kind face was a welcome sight amid the chaos. He made his way to the counter, nodding at the crowd with his usual gentle smile. Quite a morning you're having, Jake, Reverend Cole said, sliding onto a stool. Jake wiped down the counter, more for something to do with his hands than actual need. Not exactly what I had in mind for a Thursday. Sometimes the Lord works in unexpected ways, the pastor said, accepting a cup of coffee. Maybe he's reminding you that courage never hides. Jake paused his wiping. With all due respect, Reverend, I wasn't trying to be courageous. I was protecting my daughter and my employee. Exactly. Reverend Cole's eyes crinkled. True courage isn't about seeking attention. It's about doing what's right when it matters most. These people? He gestured to the packed diner. They're not here because of a viral video. They're here because you reminded them that good still exists in this world. Jake let those words sink in as he looked around his diner. Every booth was full. The counter seats were packed. Luis was smiling as he took orders, looking more confident than Jake had ever seen him. Even the regulars who usually came in for just coffee were ordering full meals. For the first time in 3 years, the register was steadily ringing. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally pay off some of those mounting bills. Give Ellie the stability she deserved. The afternoon rush brought even more customers. Jake had to call in Sarah from the evening shift early just to keep up. The local paper sent a photographer who caught Jake mid-pour, coffee pot steady in his weathered hands. The hero of Hollow Creek, the photographer said the caption would read. As evening approached, the news vans finally began to thin out, but the customers kept coming. Jake moved through it all with the same quiet efficiency he'd learned in the service, one task at a time. Stay focused, keep moving forward. Near closing time, he looked up from the grill to see Ellie sitting at the counter, back from her after-school activities. She was beaming at him, chin propped on her hands, looking so much like her mother, it made his chest ache. Pretty amazing day, huh, Dad? Jake allowed himself a small grin, the first real smile he'd worn all day. Yeah, kiddo, pretty amazing. Outside in the growing darkness, unseen by the happy crowd inside, a figure raised a camera. The shutter clicked rapidly, capturing Jake's license plate, the diner's address, and the faces of those within. The morning news buzzed from the small TV mounted in the diner's corner. Jake wiped down tables, barely listening until a familiar voice caught his attention. Luis's shaky phone video played on screen, showing Jake's confrontation with the gang members. The news anchor's voice cut through the quiet morning. Breaking news. The man who scared off gang members with 5 words is a former Navy SEAL, Jake Tanner, decorated hero of the controversial Black Ridge mission. Jake's hand froze mid-wipe. The cloth slipped from his fingers. Sources confirmed Tanner served 15 years as an elite operator before retiring under classified circumstances, following the tragic Black Ridge incident that claimed the lives of his entire team. The bell above the door chimed. Jake turned to see 3 news vans screeching to a halt outside. Reporters spilled onto the sidewalk, equipment in hand, their excited chatter audible through the glass. Dad? Ellie appeared beside him, her backpack slung over one shoulder. What's Black Ridge? Before Jake could answer, camera flashes exploded through the windows. The door burst open as reporters rushed in, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Mr. Tanner, can you comment on Black Ridge? How many missions did you serve? Why did you leave the SEALs? The questions hammered against him like bullets. His chest tightened. Suddenly, he wasn't in the diner anymore. He was back there, in those mountains. The taste of copper and gunpowder filled his mouth. Darkness, screaming, blood on his hands as he tried to stop the bleeding in Martinez's chest. Everyone out! Jake's voice boomed through the diner, snapping him back to present. The reporters fell silent. This is private property. Leave now. They backed away, but their cameras kept rolling. Jake turned to Ellie, who stood frozen by the counter. Come on, honey. I'll drive you to school. In the truck, Ellie stayed quiet, fidgeting with her backpack strap. Those people on TV, they said you were in a war? Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter. A long time ago, before you were born. Did people die? Jake's throat constricted. How could he explain Black Ridge to his 12-year-old daughter? How could he tell her about the ambush, about holding his best friends as they bled out in his arms? Some bad things happened, he said finally. But that's not who I am anymore. At the school entrance, kids clustered in groups, phones out, pointing at Jake's truck. He heard whispers, saw fingers pointing. Ellie's face paled. Dad, head high, Jake said softly. Remember what Mom always said? Our hearts make us who we are, Ellie whispered, managing a small smile. Jake watched her walk into school, his chest aching. Through the window, he saw other kids move away as she passed, their parents' whispered fears already taking root. Back at the diner, more reporters waited. Local faces he recognized lined the counter, some offering supportive nods, others avoiding his eyes. Mrs. Peterson, who'd eaten breakfast here every Sunday for years, gathered her purse and hurried out when Jake approached. "Killer," he heard someone whisper. The word triggered another flash. Multiple hostiles. Cooper screaming through the radio. "They knew we were coming!" Explosions. The metallic ping of bullets. "Man down! Man down!" Jake's hands covered in Robert's blood as his friend gasped his last words. "Not your fault, brother. Asterisk." "Jake, you okay, son?" Reverend Cole's gentle voice pulled him back. The pastor stood before him, concern etched on his weathered face. "They're calling me a killer," Jake said quietly. "They're calling you a hero, too," Cole replied. "But what matters is what you call yourself." Jake looked around his diner, his sanctuary these past 3 years. Now it felt exposed, vulnerable, like him. "I came here to find peace," he said. "To give Ellie a normal life." "Maybe normal isn't what she needs," Cole suggested. "Maybe she needs to see her father face his past with courage." The day dragged on. Jake served coffee, flipped burgers, tried to ignore the constant camera flashes through the windows. But he couldn't ignore the way some customers flinched when he approached, or how others stared too long, searching his face for signs of violence. When he picked up Ellie from school, she climbed into the truck without a word. "Rough day?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Jenny said. She said her mom won't let her come over anymore. She said you're a killer." Jake's heart shattered. He pulled into their driveway and turned to his daughter. "Ellie, look at me." She raised her eyes, so much like her mother's, full of trust. "Even now, I was a SEAL because I wanted to protect people. Yes, I've had to fight. Yes, I've lost friends. But everything I did, everything I am, is about keeping others safe. Do you understand?" Ellie threw her arms around him. "I don't care what they say. You're my dad." That night, after Ellie went to bed, Jake stood in his dark kitchen. The TV still played silently, his face appearing and disappearing in news clips. He sipped cold coffee, remembering Marianne's words in the hospital. "Promise me you'll find peace, Jake. Promise me you'll let go." A flash of movement caught his eye. He moved to the window, peering out at the diner across the street. 3 figures in hoodies worked quickly in the darkness. When they ran, they left behind their message in red spray paint across his window. "SEAL Killer." Jake stared at the dripping letters, feeling the careful peace he'd built these past 3 years crumbling around him. Jake's muscles ached as he scrubbed at the harsh red letters on the diner's window. The morning sun beat down on his back, and the sharp smell of paint thinner made his eyes water. Beside him, Ellie worked with determined focus, her small hands wrapped around a sponge. "You don't have to help with this, sweetheart," Jake said softly. "You should be getting ready for school." Ellie shook her head, her ponytail swaying. "I want to help, Dad. Besides, I still have an hour before the bus comes." Jake paused, watching his daughter attack the graffiti with the same quiet determination he recognized in himself. She was too young to deal with this mess, but here she was, refusing to back down, pride mixed with worry in his chest. The sound of engines rumbling broke the morning quiet. 3 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, and Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized the riders. The gang members from before. "Ellie," Jake said calmly, "go inside." "But Dad." "Now please." She hesitated but finally nodded, dropping her sponge in the bucket. The bell chimed as she disappeared inside. The gang members swaggered toward him, their boots crunching on loose gravel. Marco, the leader, wore a mocking smile. "Well, if it isn't the famous SEAL," Marco called out. "What was it again? You have 5 seconds to leave? Real tough guy act you got there." Jake kept scrubbing, his movements steady and controlled. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for a reaction. "You know what's funny?" Marco continued, circling Jake's parked truck. "All that training, all those medals, and here you are scrubbing windows like a janitor." The other 2 gang members snickered. Jake heard the distinct sound of metal scratching metal. He turned to see Denny dragging a key along his truck's paint job, leaving a deep groove. "That's enough," Jake said, his voice low but firm. Flint, the 3rd member, pulled out a switchblade and approached the truck's tires. The sharp blade sank into rubber with a hiss. 1 tire, then another. "Oops," Flint grinned. "Looks like you got a flat. Maybe 2. Jake set down his cleaning supplies and straightened up, his movements deliberate. The gang members tensed, but he simply reached for his phone. "I'm calling the sheriff," he stated. Marco's face darkened. Go ahead. Call your cop friend. Next time, we'll take more than rubber. He kicked the paint thinner bucket, sending chemical-soaked water spreading across the parking lot. Better watch that pretty daughter of yours real close. They roared away on their bikes, leaving Jake standing in the mess of paint thinner and deflated tires. His hands shook slightly as he dialed Sheriff Holt's number. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, his weathered face creased with concern as he surveyed the damage. I'll increase patrols in the area, Holt promised, finishing his report. But Jake, I've got to be honest with you. We're spread thin, 3 deputies for the whole county, and crime's been up since the mill closed. Jake nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The law could only do so much. Just keep your eyes open, Holt added, and maybe consider installing some security cameras. After the sheriff left, Jake stood staring at his vandalized truck, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Reverend Cole walked up, his kind face filled with concern. I saw what happened from the church, he said. Thought you might want to talk. Jake ran a hand through his hair. Not much to talk about, Reverend. There's always something to talk about with the Lord, Cole replied gently. He gestured to a nearby bench. Mind if we sit? They settled on the worn wooden seat, watching the morning traffic trickle by. You know, Cole began, when I was a chaplain in the service, I counseled a lot of men carrying heavy burdens. Guilt, regret, the weight of decisions made in impossible moments. Jake remained silent, but his shoulders tensed. The hardest part wasn't the memories, Cole continued. It was the forgiveness. Not forgiving others, forgiving themselves. With all due respect, Reverend, Jake said quietly. You don't know what happened at Black Ridge. No, I don't, Cole agreed. But I know what unforgiveness does to a man's soul. And I know that God's grace is bigger than any mistake we think we've made. Jake stared at his hands. My team trusted me. They followed my lead. And they died. How do you forgive yourself for something like that? You start by accepting that you're not meant to carry that burden alone, Cole said softly. Faith isn't about being strong enough, Jake. It's about admitting when we're not. The Reverend stood, placing a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. Come by the church any time. My door's always open. That night, after Ellie was asleep, Jake knelt beside his bed. He pulled out Mary Ann's old Bible from the bedside drawer, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use. The pages fell open to a passage she had underlined in blue ink. His fingers traced the familiar words, "Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." The verse stirred something in his heart, a memory of Mary Ann reading it to him before his deployments, her voice steady and sure. She had believed in those words, lived by them. Even in her final days, facing cancer with unwavering faith, she had chosen love over bitterness. Jake closed his eyes, the Bible pressed against his chest, and for the first time in years, he began to pray. Morning sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floor. Jake unlocked the front door, his movements automatic after years of the same routine. But today, something was different. A white envelope lay on the welcome mat, unmarked except for a single fingerprint smudge. He picked it up, the paper thin between his fingers. Inside, a hastily scrawled message made his blood run cold. "We know where your kid goes to school." Jake's hand tightened, crumpling the note. His eyes swept the empty street, searching for watchers, but only the usual morning traffic rolled past. A delivery truck, a few early commuters. Nothing suspicious. By noon, a locksmith was drilling new deadbolts into the diner's doors. The sharp whine of metal on metal filled the small space as Jake watched from behind the counter, his phone open to a security company's website. "That should do it," the locksmith said, testing the mechanism. "Military grade, just like you asked. Nobody's getting through these without a battering ram." Jake nodded, handing over his credit card. "The cameras too? Team will be here tomorrow morning. Full coverage, parking lot, all entrances, kitchen door. You'll be able to watch it all from your phone." The bell above the door chimed as Martha, his longtime waitress, walked in. Her face was drawn, purse clutched tight against her chest. "Jake," she began, voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, but I can't keep working here. My kids." "I understand," Jake said quietly. He'd been expecting this. "It's not that I don't support you," Martha rushed to explain. "You're a good man. But these gang members, they're serious trouble. And after what happened to Tommy's Deli last year, you don't have to explain, Jake assured her. Family comes first. By closing time, 3 more employees had quit. Only Luis remained, wiping tables with determined focus. You should go too, Jake told him. It's not safe here. Luis straightened, meeting Jake's eyes. With respect, sir, I'm staying. You gave me a chance when nobody else would. Besides, he added with a small smile, somebody's got to help you run this place. The next morning, Jake walked Ellie to school, his stride matching her shorter steps. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath their feet. You don't have to walk me every day, Ellie said, though she held his hand tighter. I'm not a baby. I know you're not, Jake replied. But humor your old man, okay? They fell into an easy rhythm over the next few days. Jake would point out interesting things along their route. A cardinal's nest, a neighbor's new garden, the way morning frost made spider webs glitter like diamond necklaces. Ellie would tell him about her classes, her friends, the book she was reading. Did you know, she announced one morning, that elephants can't jump? But they're still really strong. Like you, Dad. Jake chuckled. I definitely can't jump like I used to, but you're still brave, Ellie insisted. The bravest. Their walks became a sanctuary, a precious slice of peace in increasingly turbulent days. Jake found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, when the world narrowed down to just him and his daughter, sharing stories and silence. The illusion of normalcy shattered one afternoon when a news van pulled up outside the diner. A reporter in a pressed suit approached Jake as he wiped down tables, camera crew in tow. Mr. Tanner, the reporter called out, microphone extended. A moment of your time? The public wants to know, do you regret your violent past? Some say your presence here is putting the town at risk. Jake set down his cleaning cloth, aware of Ellie watching from her homework spot at the counter. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and clear. Violence was never the point. Protection was. The reporter pressed on. But the Black Ridge incident is classified, Jake cut in firmly. What isn't classified is why I served. Same reason I'm here now, to protect people who need protecting. That's all I've got to say. Later that evening, as Jake helped Ellie with her math homework, she looked up at him with serious eyes. I heard what you said to that reporter, she said. About protection. That's what heroes do, isn't it? Jake's throat tightened. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. Yes, you are, Ellie insisted. Heroes protect people. That's what you did in the Navy, and that's what you do now. Mom always said so. Jake blinked hard, remembering Marianne's words before his last deployment. Come back to us, hero. That night, Jake tucked Ellie into bed, smoothing her blanket just the way she liked. Her room was a cozy sanctuary of stuffed animals and fairy lights, Marianne's touches preserved like amber memories. Good night, Dad, Ellie murmured, already half asleep. Good night, sweetheart. Jake kissed her forehead, then moved to close her curtains. Through the window, a pair of headlights flashed in the darkness. They lingered for a moment, then slowly rolled past. Jake's muscles tensed as he watched the unmarked car disappear around the corner, knowing with cold certainty that someone was watching their house. Jake's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness. Something had woken him, a sound maybe, or just that sixth sense he'd developed during his years as a SEAL. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet house, then slid out of bed without making a sound. The wooden floor was cold beneath his feet as he made his way to Ellie's room. She was sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across her pillow. Jake let out a slow breath, relieved to see her safe, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. He went downstairs and opened the front door, scanning the street. Everything looked normal until his eyes landed on his truck. The sight made his stomach drop. The windshield was a spider web of broken glass, and a piece of paper fluttered against the wipers. Jake approached cautiously, years of training kicking in as he checked for any other threats. The note was typed this time. Next time, it's your girl. Jake's hands trembled as he read the words. Not from fear, from anger. He crumpled the paper in his fist and pulled out his phone to call Sheriff Holt. They're escalating, the sheriff said when he arrived 20 minutes later. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink. This is getting serious, Jake. You think I don't know that? Jake's voice was tight. They threatened my daughter. Sheriff Holt ran a hand over his weathered face. I'm assigning Deputy Mills to check in on you daily. He'll swing by the diner. Make sure everything's okay. A deputy? Jake shook his head. Ray, these people aren't afraid of badges. Maybe not. But it's better than nothing. The sheriff's eyes softened. You're not alone in this, Jake. The whole town's behind you. Jake wanted to believe that, but the memory of those whispers, killer, dangerous, still echoed in his mind. Upstairs, he heard Ellie stirring. You're staying home today, sweetheart, he called up when she appeared at the top of the stairs. But Dad, I have a math test. Not today. His tone left no room for argument. The diner opened late that morning. Jake had to drive Ellie's old bike to work. It was better than nothing. Customers filled the seats despite the delay, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. They spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at Jake as he worked the grill. Everyone's talking about what happened to your truck, Luis said as he refilled coffee cups. They're saying you should have hit those guys harder when they first came in. Jake's jaw tightened. Violence isn't the answer, Luis. But you were a SEAL. You could have... That's enough. Jake's voice was firm but gentle. Being strong doesn't mean you have to prove it. Around noon, Reverend Cole came in. He sat at the counter, ordered his usual black coffee, and watched Jake work for a few minutes before speaking. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he said finally. Jake couldn't help but smile slightly. That's what you're going with, Sam? The Reverend chuckled. Well, it's true. Sometimes the storms in our lives push us toward shelter we didn't know we needed. He paused. Come to church on Sunday, Jake. Bring Ellie. It might help calm the storm. Jake wiped his hands on his apron, avoiding the Reverend's eyes. I haven't been to church since Marianne died. God hasn't forgotten you. Maybe. Jake's voice was barely audible. But I'm not sure he still listens to men like me. He listens to all his children, Reverend Cole said softly. Especially the ones who think they're lost. Jake thought about it all week. Every time Deputy Mills stopped by, looking young and nervous in his crisp uniform. Every time he caught Ellie watching him with worried eyes. Every time he walked past his broken truck. Sunday morning came bright and clear. Jake stood in front of his closet, staring at the one suit he owned. The one he'd worn to Marianne's funeral. His hands shook slightly as he put it on. You look handsome, Dad, Ellie said when he came downstairs. She was wearing the blue dress Marianne had bought her for Easter, 2 years ago now. It was a little short at the ankles. The church was an old brick building with white columns out front. Jake hesitated at the steps, but Ellie took his hand and pulled him forward. Inside, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the wooden pews. They sat in the back row. Jake's posture was rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The familiar smell of old hymn books and furniture polish brought back memories he'd tried to forget. Marianne singing in the choir, Ellie's baptism, countless Sunday mornings that seemed a lifetime ago. Reverend Cole stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. Today, we're going to talk about redemption, he began. Not the kind that comes easily, but the kind that requires courage. The kind that asks us to face our fears and trust in something greater than ourselves. Jake's jaw tightened as he listened. He felt tears welling up in his eyes but refused to let them fall. Beside him, Ellie slipped her small hand into his and squeezed gently. The sunlight through the stained glass windows seemed to grow brighter, bathing them all in colors of hope and grace. Jake sat silently, letting the words wash over him, wondering if maybe, just maybe, God was still listening after all. The church bells chimed softly as people filed out of the morning service. Jake stood awkwardly near the steps, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He wasn't used to being in church anymore, hadn't been since Marianne's funeral. But Ellie seemed lighter here, and that was worth any discomfort he felt. Mr. Tanner, a woman touched his arm gently. He recognized her as the owner of the flower shop downtown. We're so glad you came today. Your daughter is just precious. Before Jake could respond, others gathered around. The hardware store owner clapped him on the shoulder. The elderly librarian squeezed his hand. Their warmth felt genuine, not like the fearful whispers he'd heard all week. Jake, Reverend Cole's calm voice cut through the crowd. There's someone I'd like you to meet. He gestured to a young woman beside him with kind eyes and an easy smile. This is my daughter, Grace. Nice to finally meet you, Grace said. Dad's told me so much about you and Ellie. Jake nodded politely. Your father's been very kind to us. Grace runs our youth outreach program, Reverend Cole explained. She has quite a way with young people. As if on cue, Ellie appeared at Jake's side. Her eyes lit up when she saw Grace. "I love your necklace," she said, pointing to the delicate cross Grace wore. "Thank you." Grace's whole face brightened. "Would you like to see the youth room? We just painted it last week." Ellie looked up at Jake hopefully. He smiled and nodded. "Go ahead." They watched as Grace led Ellie inside, the two already deep in conversation. "Your daughter's special," Reverend Cole said softly. "She has your strength, but her mother's gentle heart." Jake swallowed hard. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by her, trying to raise her alone." "You're not alone anymore," the Reverend reminded him. "That's what community means." Later that afternoon, Jake found himself in the diner's kitchen, preparing huge pots of his signature chili. Grace had mentioned the shelter needed meals for their weekly veterans' dinner, and before he knew it, he'd volunteered the diner. The kitchen was alive with activity. Grace and Ellie worked together making cornbread while Luis chopped vegetables. Even Sheriff Holt had stopped by with donations from the grocery store. "This smells amazing," Grace said, leaning over one of the pots. "No wonder your diner's so popular." "It's my mom's recipe," Ellie announced proudly. "Dad says she could make anything taste good." Jake stirred the chili quietly, remembering Mary Ann in this same kitchen, dancing as she cooked. The memory didn't hurt as much today. By evening, the diner was full of people. Veterans sat at tables with their families, sharing stories over steaming bowls. Young volunteers from Grace's program helped serve. The walls seemed to glow with warmth and conversation. Mrs. Chen from the dry cleaners brought homemade dumplings. The baker donated fresh rolls. Someone started playing guitar in the corner. It felt like the whole town was there, not to gawk at Jake's past, but to simply be together. Jake watched from behind the counter as Ellie and Grace moved through the crowd with plates of food. His daughter was laughing, really laughing, for the first time in weeks. Grace caught his eye and smiled, giving him a thumbs up. "Quite a change from last Sunday," Reverend Cole said, appearing beside him. Jake nodded. The diner felt different tonight, like it wasn't just his burden anymore, but something bigger, something healing. "Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our greatest challenges," the Reverend continued. "You opened your doors when many would have locked them. That matters, Jake." Through the windows, the sunset painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Inside, the diner glowed with fellowship and hope. Jake leaned against the counter, allowing himself a small smile as he watched Ellie help an elderly veteran to his seat. In that moment, the weight he'd carried since Black Ridge felt just a little lighter. But beyond the warm circle of light from the diner's windows, a car sat idle in the growing darkness, its engine running quietly. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Jake pulled into the diner's parking lot. His heart sank at the sight of yellow police tape fluttering in the breeze. Sheriff Holt stood by the entrance, notebook in hand, studying the crude red letters sprawled across the front window. Trader's Seal. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tight. 3 years of trying to build a peaceful life, and now this. He stepped out of his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Morning, Jake," Sheriff Holt said, his voice gentle. "We got the call around 5 a.m. Security camera caught them, but they wore masks." Jake nodded, his jaw set. The paint looked fresh, still dripping in places. "I'll clean it up." "There's something else." The sheriff hesitated. "We identified one of them, Rico Alvarez. He's been asking around about you." The name hit Jake like a punch to the gut. "Miguel's brother?" "Yes, the young soldier from your last mission." Jake closed his eyes, memories flooding back. The ambush in the mountains, the desperate firefight. Miguel Alvarez, barely 22, bleeding out despite Jake's best efforts to save him. "Rico's been running with a rough crowd," Sheriff Holt continued. "Leading them, actually. He's been in and out of trouble since his brother died." Jake grabbed his cleaning supplies from the truck. As he worked on scrubbing away the paint, townsfolk walked by, some offering sympathetic looks, others hurrying past with averted eyes. Around noon, he heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate steps. "So this is where you've been hiding." Jake turned. Rico Alvarez stood there, older than in the photos Jake had seen, anger etched deep in his face. 2 of his gang members flanked him, keeping their distance. "Rico," Jake said quietly. "I'm sorry about Miguel." "Sorry?" Rico's laugh was bitter. "You left him there to die." "That's not what happened." Jake set down his cleaning rag. We were ambushed. I tried to save him. You were his commander." Rico's voice cracked. "He trusted you." A small crowd gathered, watching from across the street. Jake could feel their eyes, hear their whispers. "Your brother was a hero," Jake said. "He saved 3 civilians that day. But the enemy had us pinned down. I did everything I could." "Liar!" Rico stepped closer, his hands balled into fists. "You survived. Everyone else died. How convenient." Jake's old instincts screamed at him to take a defensive stance, to prepare for the attack he could see building in Rico's eyes. Instead, he kept his arms loose at his sides. "I live with that guilt every day," Jake said softly. "But violence won't bring Miguel back." "No." Rico's smile was cold. "But it might make me feel better." He lunged forward, swinging. Jake stepped back, refusing to raise his hands. The punch grazed his jaw. "Fight back!" Rico shouted, throwing another wild punch that Jake simply avoided. "No," Jake said firmly. "This isn't the answer, Rico." The crowd had grown larger. Among them, Jake spotted Reverend Cole, watching with concerned eyes. Rico's face twisted with fury and grief. "You're a coward. You don't deserve to live when he's dead. Your brother wouldn't want this," Jake said. "He was a protector, just like you wanted to be once." Rico froze, his next punch hanging in the air. Tears glistened in his eyes. "You don't know what he would want," Rico spat, but his voice wavered. "You don't know anything." Jake turned away, walking toward the diner's entrance. Behind him, Rico shouted, "This isn't over, Tanner!" The crowd dispersed as Rico and his gang drove off. Reverend Cole approached, placing a steady hand on Jake's shoulder. "That took more courage than any fight," the pastor said quietly. Jake touched his bruised jaw. "Doesn't feel like courage. Feels like I failed his brother all over again." Walking away from violence when everything in you wants to fight back. "That's the truest kind of courage," Reverend Cole said. "You're showing Rico there's another way." Jake spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of running the diner. As night fell, he called Grace, asking if Ellie could stay with her. "Of course," Grace answered warmly. "Dad and I will keep her safe." Jake drove Ellie to the Coles' house, his daughter unusually quiet in the passenger seat. "It's just for tonight, sweetheart," he assured her. "Until things calm down." Ellie hugged him tight before going inside. "I'm proud of you, Dad, for not fighting today." Back at the diner, Jake sat alone in the darkness. The wall clock ticked loudly, each sound like a gunshot echoing in his memory. Click! Miguel's face, young and scared. Click! The ambush. Click! The weight of his fellow SEAL's body as Jake tried to carry him to safety. The empty diner felt as vast as those mountains had been, filled with the same heavy silence that had followed the firefight. Jake bowed his head, the weight of 2 wars, past and present, pressing down on his shoulders. 3 days passed like a gentle exhale after a long-held breath. The autumn air carried a crisp sweetness, and the morning light painted Main Street in soft golden hues. Jake stood on a ladder outside the diner, carefully applying a fresh coat of paint over the last traces of graffiti. His muscles ached from the repetitive motion, but it was an honest kind of pain, the kind that came from rebuilding rather than fighting. Inside, the breakfast crowd had thinned to just a few regulars, nursing their coffee. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake turned to see Luis walking in, carrying something flat, wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Tanner," Luis called out, his usual shy demeanor replaced by excitement. "I got something for you." Jake climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on his apron. "What's this about?" Luis carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a framed photograph. It showed the diner on reopening day, packed with smiling faces. Through the window, you could see Jake at the grill, and Ellie's ponytail bouncing as she served plates. "I took this the day we reopened," Luis explained, his voice soft but steady. "Look how many people came. You made this place safe again, Mr. Tanner. Not just for me, but for everyone." Jake's throat tightened as he took the frame. The sunlight caught the glass, reflecting the warmth of that day. Before the threats, before the fear had crept back in. He saw himself in the photo, focused on his work, but with the hint of a smile playing at his lips. "Thank you, Luis," Jake managed, clearing his throat. "This means a lot." Later that morning, Ellie bounded into the diner, her backpack swinging. "Dad, don't forget about the parent luncheon today." Jake's stomach dropped. He'd completely forgotten. "Honey, I don't know if I can leave the diner." "Please?" Ellie's eyes sparkled with that same determination her mother used to have. "I'm giving a speech, and I really want you there." How could he say no to that face? Jake looked at Luis, who immediately straightened up. "I can handle things here, Mr. Tanner. Go." An hour later, Jake sat somewhat uncomfortably in the school cafeteria, surrounded by other parents. He changed his shirt but still smelled faintly of paint and cooking oil. The principal introduced the student speakers, and then Ellie stepped up to the microphone. She unfolded a piece of paper with trembling hands, but her voice rang clear. "My essay is about heroes," she began. "Not the kind in movies with capes and superpowers, but the real kind. The ones who protect others even when they're scared themselves." Jake's chest tightened as Ellie continued. "My dad runs a diner in town. Some people think that's not an important job, but they're wrong. He makes sure everyone who comes in feels safe and welcome. He stands up to bullies. He works hard every day to make our town better." Tears pricked at Jake's eyes as his daughter's words washed over him. He noticed other parents nodding, some wiping their eyes too. Ellie's simple truth cut through all the complicated layers of his past. "Heroes aren't people who are never afraid," Ellie concluded. "They're people who choose to be brave anyway. Thank you." The cafeteria erupted in applause. Jake stood up, clapping until his hands hurt, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. After the luncheon, as they walked back to the diner, Ellie slipped her hand into his. "Did you like my speech, Dad?" Jake squeezed her hand. "I loved it, sweetheart. You made me proud." When they reached the diner, they found Reverend Cole waiting outside. His kind face creased in a warm smile. "Jake, Ellie, just the people I wanted to see." The pastor explained his idea, a community fundraiser to help cover the repair costs for the diner. "The whole town wants to pitch in," he said. "We're thinking a Saturday night potluck, maybe some live music. Show you you're not alone in this." Jake started to protest, but Reverend Cole held up his hand. "This isn't charity, Jake. This is community. This is what healing looks like." That evening, after the dinner rush, Jake sat at the counter looking at Luis's photograph. Grace had stopped by to help create the fundraiser announcement online, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard as she designed a cheerful digital flyer. "There," she announced proudly, turning the screen so Jake could see. "Community night at Tanner's Diner, where good food meets good hearts." The website looked professional and welcoming. Jake felt something shift inside him, a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Maybe Reverend Cole was right. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Grace hit the publish button with a flourish, and the invitation went live, spreading across social media like ripples in a pond. What none of them could know was that among the hundreds of notifications lighting up phones across town, one would reach Rico's gang, sparking a dangerous new flame of opportunity. But for now, in this moment, Jake allowed himself to believe in renewal. He hung Luis's photograph on the wall behind the counter, right where the morning sun would catch it. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, he had his daughter's words, his community's support, and the first real taste of peace he'd known in years. The diner buzzed with warmth and life on Friday evening. Christmas lights twinkled along the walls. Ellie's idea brought to life by Grace and a crew of eager volunteers. The smell of fresh-baked rolls and Jake's signature chili filled the air. Wearing a clean blue button-down shirt that Ellie had ironed for him, Jake stood near the counter, his normally stern face softened by the genuine affection surrounding him. "I'm not much for speeches," Jake said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "But thank you all for being here. This place means everything to me and my daughter." The crowd, a beautiful mix of Hollow Creek's heart and soul, filled every booth and chair. World War II veteran Earl Thompson sat in his usual spot by the window, his medals gleaming on his navy blazer. A group of teenagers from Grace's youth program huddled near the jukebox, sneaking cookies when they thought no one was looking. Mrs. Miller, who taught 3 generations of Hollow Creek kids, beamed from her seat next to the Reverend's wife. Reverend Cole stood, raising his hands for quiet. "Before we dig into Jake's famous chili, let's bow our heads in thanks." The room fell silent as his warm voice filled the space. "Lord, we thank you for this food, this fellowship, and for bringing Jake and Ellie into our lives. Bless this diner and make it a beacon of your love. Amen." "Amen," the crowd echoed. Grace squeezed Ellie's shoulder. "Your turn, sweetie." Ellie stood nervously at the front, her dark hair pulled back with the butterfly clip her mother had given her. The room hushed as her clear voice began to sing Amazing Grace, the hymn Marianne had sung in church every Sunday. Jake gripped the counter's edge, his knuckles white as memories washed over him. Amazing Grace! How sweet the sound. The simple melody wrapped around everyone like a warm blanket. Mrs. Miller dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Even crusty old Earl looked misty-eyed. Jake felt a tear slip down his cheek and quickly wiped it away, but not before Louise noticed and passed him a clean dish towel with a knowing smile. As Ellie finished, applause filled the diner. She rushed to her father, who wrapped her in a tight hug. "Mom would be so proud," he whispered into her hair. The evening settled into comfortable conversation and laughter. Sheriff Holt shared stories from his rookie days. Grace taught some of the teens how to properly fold napkins into swans. The atmosphere felt like Thanksgiving and Christmas rolled into one, a celebration of community and second chances. Jake was refilling coffee cups when the crash came. The bricks sailed through the front window in a shower of glass and fury. Women screamed. Earl Thompson, despite his bad hip, moved faster than anyone would have thought possible, pulling Mrs. Miller away from the spray of shards. The brick landed with a thud near the counter, a note wrapped around it with rubber bands. "Everyone stay calm." Sheriff Holt's authoritative voice cut through the panic. "Move away from the windows. Deputies are outside." Jake's eyes found Ellie immediately. Grace had pulled her behind the counter, shielding her from the glass. His daughter's face was pale but determined, so much like her mother's in times of crisis. "Is anyone hurt?" Jake called out, forcing his voice to stay steady. A chorus of shaken no's answered him. Sheriff Holt picked up the brick with a handkerchief, carefully removing the note. His face darkened as he read it. "Jake," he said quietly, "we need to talk." But before they could step aside, Reverend Cole's voice rang out. "No more secrets," he said firmly. "Whatever threatens one of us, threatens all of us." The sheriff nodded slowly. "The note says, next time won't be just glass." A heavy silence fell. Then Earl Thompson's gruff voice broke it. "Well, they'll have to go through all of us first." "That's right," Mrs. Miller added, brushing glass dust from her skirt. "We're not letting them win." One by one, people stood up, voicing their support. The teens started sweeping up glass. Grace organized a cleanup crew. Sheriff Holt stepped outside to coordinate with his deputies, promising, "We'll catch them this time. No one threatens our town like this." Through it all, Jake stood rooted in place, overwhelmed by the show of solidarity. Ellie slipped her hand into his. "We're not alone anymore, Dad," she whispered. Hours later, after the last of the glass was swept up and plywood covered the window, Jake drove home with Ellie. The house felt too quiet after the evening's chaos. He watched as she got ready for bed, her movements slower than usual, weighted by the night's events. "Dad?" she asked as he tucked her in. "Are you scared?" Jake sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. Being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared. She nodded, clutching her mother's old teddy bear. "Like you did in the Navy?" "Like your mom did every day," he corrected gently. "She taught me that real courage is about love, not fighting." Ellie's eyes grew heavy. Jake kissed her forehead and whispered, "You're safe now." He turned off the light but lingered in the doorway, watching her peaceful face in the glow of her nightlight. His own face was tense as he walked down the hallway, every muscle coiled tight. The night's violence had shattered more than just glass. It had broken the illusion of peace they'd started to build. Somewhere out there, Rico and his gang were planning their next move. Jake knew the storm wasn't over, not by a long shot. The rain fell in heavy sheets across Hollow Creek, drumming against the diner's windows. Jake wiped down the counter one last time, his movements slow and methodical. The day's earlier joy from the fundraiser felt distant now, washed away by the gloomy weather and his growing unease. "Dad?" Ellie called from the kitchen. "Can I go feed Whiskers before it gets too dark?" Jake glanced at his watch. 5:30 p.m. The storm had turned the afternoon sky an early charcoal gray. "Make it quick, sweetie. Straight to the alley and back. Promise." She grabbed her purple backpack where she kept the cat food and zipped up her raincoat. The little bell above the door chimed as she stepped out into the downpour. Jake continued his closing routine, stacking chairs and counting the register. The fundraiser money sat heavy in the safe beneath his feet. a reminder of the community's kindness but also of how much they now had to lose. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while his mind wandered to darker places. Across the street, Luis huddled under the awning of the hardware store, waiting for his mom to pick him up after her shift at the hospital. He pulled his jacket tighter, watching the rain create rivers along the curb. Movement caught his eye. A dark van creeping down the alley, where he knew Ellie fed that stray cat she loved so much. The screech of tires cut through the rain. No! Ellie's terrified scream pierced the air. Luis's heart stopped. Through the curtain of rain, he saw them. 3 masked figures dragging Ellie toward the van. Her raincoat flashed yellow in the gloom as she kicked and fought. "Jake!" Luis screamed, fumbling for his phone. His trembling fingers hit speed dial. "They're taking her! The alley!" Inside the diner, Jake's world tilted on its axis. The phone clattered to the floor as he burst through the back door, his feet pounding against wet pavement. Rain soaked through his shirt in seconds, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the surge of adrenaline, the switch in his mind flipping from civilian to SEAL. But he was too late. The van's tires squealed against wet asphalt as it peeled away. Jake sprinted after it, his legs pumping harder than they had in years. For a moment, he caught a glimpse of Ellie's face pressed against the back window, her small hand reaching out. "Ellie!" The name tore from his throat, raw and primal. The van turned the corner and disappeared into the storm. Jake's legs gave out. He crashed to his knees in a puddle, mud soaking through his jeans. The rain mixed with tears on his face as he screamed her name again and again, each cry more broken than the last. Luis ran to him, soaked and shaking. "I called 911! They're coming!" But Jake barely heard him. His fingers dug into the mud, finding something solid. Ellie's backpack dropped in the struggle. Cat food spilled from the torn zipper, dissolving in the rain. He clutched it to his chest, rocking slightly. Above them, mounted on the corner of Miller's Hardware, a security camera whirred quietly. Its red light blinked steadily through the storm, having captured every moment of his daughter's abduction. Jake knelt there in the pouring rain, holding that empty backpack like it was the only thing keeping him from drowning. His little girl, his whole world, was gone. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. Police lights cut through the rain. Sheriff Holt's cruiser pulled up, splashing through puddles. But Jake stayed frozen, water streaming down his face, as the security camera continued its silent witness to a father's worst nightmare. "They took her," he whispered, his voice hollow. "They took my baby girl." The rain kept falling, washing away any traces of the van's tire tracks, while Jake remained on his knees in the middle of the flooded alley, still gripping that muddy backpack, the last thing his daughter had touched. Morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of Hollow Creek's small church, casting colored shadows across Jake Tanner's bowed head. He sat alone in the front pew, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a sleepless night. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and his usually steady voice cracked as he whispered a desperate prayer. Reverend Cole's footsteps echoed softly through the empty sanctuary as he approached. The pastor's kind face showed his own lack of sleep. He'd been up all night with the police, helping coordinate the search for Ellie. He settled quietly next to Jake, placing a weathered Bible between them. "I failed her." Jake's words came out barely above a whisper. "Just like I failed my team." The morning silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of rain against the church windows. Reverend Cole opened his Bible with careful hands, the pages rustling gently. "The Lord is my strength and my shield," he read, his voice steady and warm. "In him my heart trusts, and I am helped." Jake's shoulders trembled. "I don't deserve his help. Not after everything." "Son," Reverend Cole turned to face him directly, "God's grace isn't about what we deserve. It's about his love for us." Tears filled Jake's eyes as the guilt he'd carried for years finally spilled out. "You don't understand. That mission, Black Ridge, it wasn't just a failed operation. I was the team leader. I made the call that got them killed." The pastor listened patiently as Jake described that terrible day, the ambush, the impossible choice, the loss of his brothers in arms. His voice grew hoarse with emotion. "And now Ellie." Jake's words caught in his throat. "She's paying for my mistakes." Reverend Cole placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "The past doesn't define you, Jake. Not in God's eyes. How can you be so sure? Because I see what you've done with this diner. You've turned it into a place of hope. You've shown kindness to troubled youth, fed the hungry, given second chances. The pastor's eyes were kind but firm. God didn't bring you this far to lose her now. Jake looked up, really looked at the pastor for the first time that morning. But how do I find her without becoming the man I used to be? Without violence? Your military training, it wasn't just about combat, was it? No, Jake admitted. It was about protecting people, saving lives. Then use those skills the way God intended. With wisdom, not wrath. With faith, not fear. Something shifted in Jake's expression. A spark of hope replacing the despair that had haunted his eyes since Ellie's disappearance. He sat straighter, his breathing steadier. You're right, he said quietly. I've been so afraid of my past that I forgot why I joined the SEALs in the first place, to help people, to protect them. Reverend Cole nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Sometimes our greatest struggles become our greatest tools for good, when we surrender them to God's purpose. Jake stood slowly, purpose replacing his earlier defeat. I need to go home. There's something I need to get. What's that? My old duffel bag. Not for weapons, Jake added quickly, seeing the concern flash across the pastor's face. It has tools, detailed maps of the area, a first aid kit, things that might help bring Ellie home safely. Reverend Cole stood as well, placing both hands on Jake's shoulders. Remember, Jake, you're not alone in this. The whole town is praying, and God goes before you. Jake nodded, grateful for the pastor's steady presence. He walked down the church aisle, his steps measured and determined. The colored light from the windows fell across his path like a blessing, and for the first time since Ellie's kidnapping, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt faith. At the church door, he paused, looking back at Reverend Cole. Thank you, he said simply. Then he stepped out into the morning light, heading home to retrieve his duffel bag, not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of rescue and redemption. The morning drizzle had turned the tire tracks behind Jake's house into muddy grooves. He crouched down, studying their depth and direction. His old SEAL training kicked in, but this time it wasn't rage driving him, it was love and determination. The van had peeled out fast, leaving deeper impressions on one side. They were in a hurry, nervous. A piece of bright blue fabric caught his eye, snagged on a chain-link fence. Jake carefully removed it, recognizing the material from Ellie's favorite jacket. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to focus. This wasn't about his pain, it was about bringing her home. Jake walked the quiet streets of Hollow Creek, showing Ellie's photo to shopkeepers and regulars who might have seen something. Most shook their heads, offering prayers instead of information. But Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner store, remembered a white van speeding through her security camera's view. Never seen it before, she said, wringing her hands. Headed east, toward the old industrial district, Jake thanked her quietly, each small detail building a map in his mind. The industrial district where empty factories stood like steel graveyards. Perfect hiding spots for people who didn't want to be found. At the diner, Luis was waiting. The young man's face was pale, but his eyes were determined. Mr. Tanner, I got something. He pulled up the security footage on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys. I enhanced the video from last night. Together, they watched the grainy footage. The van's license plate came into focus for just a second. Luis had isolated the frame, cleaning it up as best he could. It's registered to a construction company that went bankrupt last year, Luis said. But look at this. He pointed to a logo barely visible on the van's side, a faded wolf's head. Jake recognized it immediately. The same symbol had been spray-painted on his diner weeks ago. Good work, Luis, he said, squeezing the young man's shoulder. Really good work. Sheriff Holt arrived shortly after, his weathered face grave. Jake, we've got patrol cars searching the industrial district. Let us handle this. These men are dangerous, and they're looking to hurt you specifically. Ray, Jake said quietly, using the sheriff's first name. You know I can't stay back, not with Ellie out there. The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his face. I knew you'd say that. Just remember you're not in the field anymore. This isn't a war zone. No, Jake agreed. It's more important than that. Jake spent the next hour studying maps of the industrial district. The old lumber mill caught his attention isolated, multiple exits, good vantage points, perfect for a gang's hideout. He'd seen similar setups overseas, though thinking about those days still made his chest tight. He packed carefully. Flashlight, rope, first aid kit, but no weapons. The weight of his old combat knife felt wrong now. This wasn't about fighting. It was about bringing his daughter home safely. The drive to the industrial district was silent except for the patter of rain on the windshield. Jake parked his truck a quarter mile from the mill, out of sight. The massive building loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark eyes watching his approach. Moving from shadow to shadow, Jake confirmed his suspicions. Fresh tire tracks led to a side entrance. A cigarette butt still smoldered near a doorway. And there, partially hidden behind rusted machinery, was the white van. Jake found cover behind an old shipping container and closed his eyes. The prayer came naturally now, not forced like in his earlier years. Lord, guide my hands, not for harm, but for help. The words steadied him, reminding him of his purpose. The rain had picked up, providing natural cover for his movements. Jake moved closer to the building, his footsteps silent despite his size. The skills that had once made him a weapon were now tools for rescue, for protection rather than destruction. Water dripped steadily from the mill's rusted gutters, creating a rhythm that masked his approach. Through broken windows, he could hear voices' rough laughter echoing in the vast space. Jake pressed himself against the wet concrete wall, listening, planning, and most importantly, praying. His daughter was in there. And this time, he wouldn't let his past determine her future. Each step forward was a step guided by faith, not fear. Moving toward a partially open door, Jake could make out more distinct sounds. Footsteps on metal walkways, the scrape of chairs, distant voices. He slipped inside, becoming one with the shadows of the abandoned mill. The sound of dripping water followed him in, mixing with the echoes of laughter from somewhere ahead. His heart beat steady and strong. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about redemption, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. As he moved deeper into the darkness, Jake held on to that truth like a lifeline. The abandoned mill loomed against the night sky, its broken windows like dark eyes staring down at Jake. Water dripped steadily from rusted pipes, creating hollow echoes through the empty building. Jake moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the wet concrete floor. Years of SEAL training guided each careful step. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting strange shadows across piles of old machinery. The musty smell of decay filled his nose. His heart pounded, but his hands remained steady. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about bringing his daughter home. A voice drifted from somewhere above, rough laughter, then footsteps. Jake pressed himself against a wall, letting the darkness hide him. He counted 3 distinct voices, Marco's high-pitched chuckle, Denny's nervous stammer, and Flint's deep rumble. But no Rico yet. Jake found the stairs, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The old metal wanted to groan, but he distributed his weight carefully, moving like a ghost. 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The voices grew clearer. "Kid's been quiet," Marco was saying. "Maybe we should check." "Leave her be," came Rico's voice, sharp with authority. "This ain't about her." Jake's jaw clenched. He pictured Ellie alone in the dark, scared but trying to be brave, just like her mother would have been. The thought nearly broke his careful control, but he held steady. Rushing in would only put her in more danger. He reached the 4th floor, where light spilled from under a door at the end of the hall. But something made him pause. A slight sound, barely there. A sniffle, coming from a heavy metal door to his left. Storage room. The lock was old, the kind that would make noise if he tried to pick it. Jake pulled out a small bottle of oil from his pack, working it into the mechanism with practiced patience. 3 drops. Wait. 2 more. The lock turned silently. Ellie sat in the corner, hands tied but eyes alert. When she saw him, her face lit up, but she knew better than to make a sound. Jake moved quickly to her side, fingers working at the ropes. "Daddy," she whispered, so quiet it was barely a breath. "I'm here, baby," he murmured back. "You're safe now." The door creaked. Jake turned, pushing Ellie behind him. Rico stood in the doorway, gun raised, but hand trembling slightly. In the dim light, Jake could see the pain etched deep in the younger man's face. The same pain he'd carried for years. "You left him there," Rico said, voice rough. "My brother. You just left him." Jake slowly raised his hands, keeping his body between Rico and Ellie. "No," he said softly. "I carried him for 3 miles. He died in my arms." Rico's gun wavered. "You're lying." His name was Miguel Alvarez. He loved baseball. Yankees fan. Kept a picture of you in his helmet. Jake's voice stayed steady, gentle. "His last words were about you, telling me to make sure you knew he wasn't afraid." Tears filled Rico's eyes. "Shut up!" "I never forgot him, Rico." Jake reached slowly into his jacket, movements deliberate. Rico's gun followed him, but Jake pulled out only a worn set of dog tags. "I've carried these every day since." The metal caught the light, Miguel's name clearly visible. Rico stared at them, his whole body shaking now. "He was my brother," Rico whispered. "My little brother." "I know." Jake held out the tags. "He was my brother too. We all were." In the distance, police sirens began to wail. Luis had come through, alerting Sheriff Holt. The sound grew closer, red and blue lights starting to flash through the broken windows. Rico looked at the tags, then at Jake and Ellie. The gun lowered slowly, tears now flowing freely down his face. Jake stepped forward, pressing the dog tags into Rico's hand. "It's time to let go of the hate," Jake said quietly. "Miguel would want you to live." The gun clattered to the floor. Rico's knees buckled, and Jake caught him as he fell, holding him like he'd once held his brother. Through the windows, dawn was breaking, painting the old mill in soft gold light. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, Sheriff Holt and his deputies, but the violence was over. In the growing light, Jake finally pulled Ellie into his arms, holding her tight as she buried her face in his shoulder. They had made it through the dark night, and morning had come at last. The morning sun streamed through the diner's freshly cleaned windows, catching on the new wind chimes Ellie had insisted on hanging. Their gentle tinkling mixed with the happy chatter of what seemed like half the town packed into Jake's small restaurant. The smell of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls filled the air. Jake stood behind the counter, overwhelmed by the turnout. People lined the walls and spilled onto the sidewalk outside. Reverend Cole had helped organize this reopening celebration, but Jake hadn't expected such a crowd. Even some folks who'd once whispered about him being dangerous were here, offering hesitant but genuine smiles. Grace moved efficiently between tables, serving coffee with Luis's help. She'd decorated the place with cheerful yellow flowers and white tablecloths borrowed from the church. The diner looked brighter than it had in years, more like the place Mary Ann had once loved. Sheriff Holt stood near the entrance, his badge catching the morning light. He'd been instrumental in keeping the peace these past few days, handling the aftermath of Rico's arrest with a firm but compassionate hand. Now he cleared his throat, tapping a spoon against his coffee mug to get everyone's attention. "Folks," the sheriff began, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "I'd like to say a few words about Jake Tanner." The crowd quieted, turning toward him. Jake felt his neck grow warm at the attention, but he stood straighter, Ellie's small hand finding his behind the counter. "In all my years wearing this badge," Holt continued, "I've seen plenty of tough men, but true courage, that's rare. Jake here faced down a threat to his family, and he did it without throwing a single punch." The sheriff's eyes met Jake's. "He showed us that real strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how steady you can stand when everything's falling apart." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake noticed Rico's younger brother, Miguel Jr., standing near the back with Reverend Cole. The boy was only 15, but his eyes held an old pain that was slowly healing. He'd started attending the youth program at the church, finding a better path than his brother had chosen. "Some folks thought having a former SEAL in town meant trouble," Holt went on. "Instead, Jake showed us what those military values really mean. Honor, courage, and protecting others, even at great personal cost." A few amens sounded from the crowd. Jake felt tears pricking at his eyes, but blinked them back. Ellie squeezed his hand harder. Reverend Cole stepped forward next, his kind face beaming. "Jake has taught us all something about forgiveness," he said. "Not just forgiving others, but the harder task of forgiving ourselves." He gestured to Miguel Jr., who stood a little straighter, "and his example has inspired others to choose a better way." The pastor's daughter Grace paused in her serving to smile at Jake. She'd been a rock through all of this, helping Ellie cope and showing Jake that faith could be as practical as it was spiritual. Jake felt a gentle nudge from Ellie. She wanted him to speak. He'd never been one for public talking, but looking at these faces, neighbors who'd become family, he knew he owed them words. Clearing his throat, Jake spoke softly, but his voice carried in the hushed diner. "Peace doesn't come from hiding," he said, thinking of all the years he'd tried to bury his past. "It comes from forgiving, even ourselves." He paused, looking at Miguel Jr., "Especially ourselves." The words seemed to settle over the crowd like a blessing. Jake saw tears in more than a few eyes, including Sheriff Holtz. Ellie tugged at his sleeve then, practically bouncing with excitement. "Can I show them my essay now, Dad?" Jake nodded, and Ellie pulled a slightly crumpled paper from her backpack. She'd written it for school last week, and her teacher had given her an A+. Standing on a chair behind the counter, she held it up proudly. "My essay is called My Dad, the Protector," she announced, her voice clear and strong. Jake's heart swelled as she began to read. "Some people think being a protector means being the strongest or the scariest," she read. "But my dad showed me it means being the bravest in your heart. He protected me not by hurting bad people, but by showing them how to be good again." The diner grew very quiet as she continued. "My dad was a Navy SEAL, which means he knows 100 ways to win a fight. But the biggest fight he won was against anger and fear. He chose love instead." Jake couldn't stop the tears now. They rolled silently down his cheeks as his daughter's words washed over him. "My mom used to say that real heroes make the world better just by being in it," Ellie finished. "That's what my dad does every day. He makes our diner a place where everyone feels safe and welcome, just like home should be." Applause erupted when she finished. Jake pulled her into a tight hug, not caring who saw his tears now. Reverend Cole stepped forward again, raising his hands. "Let's sing together," he suggested. "Amazing Grace. It seems fitting." The familiar melody rose from dozens of voices. Jake closed his eyes as the hymn filled the diner. In that moment, he felt it, a presence he hadn't sensed in years. Marianne. Not as a ghost or vision, but as a warmth in his heart, a peace in his soul. He could almost hear her whisper, "You found your way home, my love." For the first time since losing her, since losing his SEAL brothers, Jake felt the weight lift completely from his shoulders. He breathed deeply, freely, joining his voice to the hymn. Ellie's hand was warm in his, and all around them, their community, their family, sang of amazing grace. How sweet the sound. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as Jake stood outside his diner, gazing up at the wooden sign that now crowned the entrance. Home of Second Chances. The carved letters proclaimed in warm, golden tones. Each letter had been carefully shaped by different townspeople, making the sign a patchwork of their community's love and support. "What do you think, Dad?" Ellie asked, squeezing his hand. Her face glowed with pride as she looked up at their renewed family business. "It's perfect," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. The sign represented more than just a name change. It was a testament to how far they'd come. Inside, Luis was already busy setting up for the morning rush, his movements confident and sure. Jake watched his young employee, now his assistant manager, organizing the kitchen with practiced ease. "Hey, boss," Luis called out, grinning as he tied on his new apron. "The coffee's fresh, and I've got those special cinnamon rolls rising that Mrs. Peterson taught me to make." Jake nodded approvingly. "You're really getting the hang of this, Luis." He remembered the shy teenager who'd first asked for a job, now transformed into a capable young man who helped run the place. The bell above the door chimed as Grace Cole entered, carrying a stack of colorful flyers. Her enthusiasm was contagious as she spread them across the counter. "The youth mentorship program starts next week," she announced. "We've already got 15 kids signed up." Jake examined one of the flyers, which featured a photo of the diner and the words, "Where Hope Meets Home," across the top. The program would provide after-school tutoring, job training, and most importantly, a safe space for local teens to gather. "Dad, look," Ellie called from her stepladder near the far wall. She was carefully painting another quote in elegant script. "Courage is faith-taking action." The walls were becoming a canvas of inspiration, with similar messages appearing between framed photographs of community events. "Careful up there, sweetheart," Jake cautioned, though he couldn't help but smile at her artistic focus. She had inherited her mother's steady hand and creative spirit. The morning light strengthened as Reverend Cole arrived, his Bible tucked under his arm and his face warm with purpose. The congregation had gathered outside, forming a circle around the building's perimeter. "Shall we begin?" the pastor asked, opening his Bible to a marked page. Everyone joined hands, regulars, staff, and newcomers alike. Jake stood between Ellie and Grace, feeling the strength of community flowing through their linked fingers. Reverend Cole's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Lord, we ask your blessing on this place of healing and hope. May it continue to be a sanctuary for the weary, a haven for the hopeful, and a testament to your grace. Amen," the group responded in unison. As they broke apart, Jake noticed a magazine reporter taking photos from a respectful distance. The Veterans Magazine article was due out next month, Faith Over Fear, a SEAL's journey from warrior to peacemaker. He'd been hesitant about the interview at first, but Reverend Cole had convinced him that his story might help other veterans find their way home. Throughout the day, the diner hummed with activity. Luis trained 2 new teenage employees, showing them the proper way to work the grill and serve customers with care. Grace set up a corner with books and computers for the mentorship program, creating a warm, inviting space for learning. Ellie finished her wall paintings, each quote carefully chosen to reflect their journey. "Look, Dad," she said, pointing to one near the register. "The bravest hearts are the ones that learn to love again." Jake wrapped an arm around her shoulders, remembering how Mary Ann used to say something similar. The diner had become more than just a business. It was a living memorial to everything she had believed in. As evening approached, the crowds thinned. The last customers left with warm goodbyes and promises to return. Luis finished cleaning up and headed home, his steps lighter than they'd been in months. Grace gathered her program materials, pausing to hug Ellie before she left. "See you tomorrow for art class?" she asked, and Ellie nodded enthusiastically. Finally, it was just Jake and Ellie, sitting in their favorite booth, the one where Mary Ann used to help Ellie with her homework. The setting sun painted the walls in soft orange and pink, making the inspirational quotes glow like gentle reminders. Jake looked at his daughter, seeing echoes of her mother in her smile. "Your mom would have loved this place," he said softly. Evening settled over Hollow Creek with a gentle grace, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that filtered through the diner's freshly cleaned windows like stained glass in a cathedral. The familiar hum of the old refrigerator mingled with the soft clink of dishes as Jake wiped down the last table with slow, deliberate strokes, just as he had done countless times before. But everything felt different now, charged with purpose, blessed with meaning. The walls, once faded and tired from years of struggle, now wore cheerful colors chosen by Ellie herself during their weekend painting party. Warm yellows, the shade of morning sunshine, and soft blues like peaceful skies made the space feel like an eternal summer morning. Photographs lined the walls in careful rows, telling stories of community and healing that grew stronger each day. The fundraiser night, when the whole town had shown up with casseroles and checkbooks, veterans sharing meals and memories over coffee that never seemed to run cold, young people from Reverend Cole's youth program helping in the kitchen with flour-dusted aprons and genuine smiles. Even the old ceiling fans seemed to spin with renewed purpose, stirring the rich aroma of fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies that Grace had taught Ellie to make from her grandmother's recipe. Luis finished counting the register drawer with practiced efficiency, his movements confident and sure, in a way that reminded Jake of his own young soldiers learning to trust their training. "All set for tonight, Mr. Tanner," he said, carefully organizing the day's receipts into neat stacks bound with rubber bands. "Best Tuesday we've had since the reopening, Mrs. Patterson came in twice. Said she forgot how good your meatloaf was." Jake nodded, feeling a familiar surge of gratitude wash over him for the young man's unwavering loyalty. In Luis, he saw echoes of the brother he'd never had, the son he'd hoped to raise alongside Ellie. "Thanks, Luis. You've earned every bit of that raise we talked about. Head on home now, and don't forget about Saturday's Veterans Breakfast." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Luis replied with a grin that transformed his usually shy face, hanging up his apron on the hook behind the counter with care. "My dad's actually coming this time. Says he wants to meet the SEAL who turned out to be more than just a warrior. He's been reading those newspaper articles about the diner." The words settled warmly in Jake's chest, like honey on fresh bread, as he watched Luis wave goodbye and leave through the front door. the little brass bell chiming his departure with its familiar, comforting song. Across the dining room, Ellie gathered her schoolbooks from her usual spot at the counter, the same red vinyl stool where she'd sat that fateful evening when everything changed, when 3 angry men had walked through that door and set their new life in motion. Her homework was different now, spread across the counter in colorful arrays. Instead of math problems and history worksheets, she'd been working on thank you cards for everyone who'd helped them rebuild, hand-drawn pictures of the diner with careful cursive messages inside. Grace had taught her to write in calligraphy, and each card was a small work of art filled with the kind of gratitude that only children could express with such pure honesty. "Ready to head home, sweetheart?" Jake asked, reaching for the light switch that would end another blessed day. Ellie nodded, slipping her backpack over her shoulders with the careful precision of a child who'd learned that everything precious should be handled with care. "Can we walk the long way tonight? Past the church?" "Sure thing." Jake smiled, understanding her request without need for explanation. The evening walk had become their new tradition, a quiet moment to share between father and daughter as the day settled into night and the stars began their ancient watch. It was during these walks that Ellie asked her deepest questions, shared her biggest dreams, and helped Jake remember why every struggle had been worth fighting. They stepped outside together into the cool embrace of spring air, and Jake locked the door with practiced ease, testing the handle twice out of old habit. The spring air carried the sweet perfume of blooming dogwoods that lined Main Street, and somewhere nearby, a robin sang its evening song from the branches of the old oak tree that had watched over this corner for longer than anyone could remember. The street that had once felt so empty and threatening now bustled with the gentle life of a community reborn. Even at this peaceful hour, when most businesses had closed and families gathered for dinner, there was movement and warmth in every direction. A group of neighborhood kids pedaled past on their bikes, baseball cards clothespinned to their spokes, creating a cheerful racket that echoed off the old brick buildings. They waved enthusiastically at Jake and Ellie, calling out greetings with the kind of joy that only children possessed. Their laughter floated on the evening breeze, bringing music to streets that had once known only silence and suspicion. 2 doors down, Mrs. Henderson carefully watered the bright flower boxes she'd started putting out since the neighborhood had begun its transformation. Petunias and marigolds spilled over the edges in riots of purple and gold, turning every storefront into a small celebration. Across the street, Mr. Kowalski swept his hardware store sidewalk with long, methodical strokes, exchanging friendly nods with Jake and asking about Ellie's soccer season. Standing there on the sidewalk, hand in hand with his daughter, Jake looked up at their new sign with wonder that hadn't faded even after weeks of seeing it every day. The carved letters caught the last rays of golden sunlight, making them glow like honey dripping from the comb. Each curve and line represented someone who'd believed in second chances, believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. He remembered the crushing weight of guilt he'd carried for so long, how it had bent his shoulders and darkened his days like a storm cloud that followed him everywhere. Now that burden felt lighter, transformed by forgiveness and faith into something that gave him strength instead of stealing it away. Above the sign, the sky had turned to watercolor, broad strips of purple and orange stretching toward the horizon, where the first evening stars waited to take their posts. It was the same sky he'd looked up at during those long, sleepless nights overseas, the same sky that had watched over him as he'd carried Rico's wounded brother to safety through enemy fire. The same sky that had witnessed his journey from warrior to peacemaker, from a man running from his past to one embracing his future. Ellie squeezed his hand with her small fingers, drawing his attention back to earth and the moment they shared. Her eyes held that same wise light they'd always carried, but now there was something new there too, understanding perhaps, or acceptance of who they were and what they'd become together. "Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a question that had been building inside her young heart. "Are we happy now?" The question hung in the cooling air, like a prayer waiting for an answer, simple and profound in the way that only children's questions could be. Jake looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing traces of Marianne in her gentle smile and the way she tilted her head, just so when she was thinking deeply. He thought about happiness, how he'd once believed it was something lost to him forever, buried with his beloved wife and his fallen brothers in graves he'd never been able to visit, how he'd tried to hide from it, thinking he didn't deserve its gentle touch after all the violence his hands had known. But here it was, Not in some grand gesture or perfect moment, but in the simple act of standing with his daughter as evening fell over their small town, in the knowledge that inside the diner's walls, people found not just meals but mercy, not just food but fellowship. In the way the town had wrapped around them like one of Marianne's quilts, proving that community could heal what time alone could never touch. "Happiness isn't something we find out there, sweetheart," he answered, his voice gentle with the conviction that had grown stronger each day. "It's something we build, together, one choice at a time, one act of kindness after another." Ellie beamed at him, her face glowing with understanding that seemed far beyond her 12 years. They began their walk home, their footsteps falling into the easy rhythm of two people who'd learned to move through the world together. Around them, Hollow Creek settled into its evening routine with the comfortable predictability of a well-loved song. The hardware store's lights winked out one by one. The bike-riding kids called goodnight to each other as they headed home for dinner and homework. Porch lights began to twinkle on like earthbound stars, each one a small beacon of home and safety. In the distance, the church bells began their evening song, 7 clear tones that floated over the town like a blessing. Each toll seemed to speak of redemption, of battles won not with fists but with faith, of darkness pushed back not by force but by love that multiplied when it was shared. The light faded slowly to purple twilight, but the sign above the diner continued to glow softly in the gathering dark, illuminated by the street light that the town council had installed just last week. Home of second chances, it proclaimed to the stars beginning to emerge above, a beacon of hope in the gentle night, a promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to show grace. And this time, Jake Tanner didn't count to 5 and wait for trouble to leave. He just let peace begin, one breath at a time, one step toward home, one moment of gratitude for the family he'd been given and the community that had chosen to embrace them both. The stars watched over Hollow Creek as father and daughter walked home together, their shadows long and peaceful on the sidewalk, their hearts full of the kind of happiness that comes not from having everything perfect, but from knowing that love can transform any ending into a new beginning. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jake Tanner, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.